Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the planet. My name is Adamantium, and welcome to this edition of AAUTZM podcast. Just like to wish everyone a happy new year, since this is the January episode. Hope everyone out there is doing good.
But also, because it is January, you know what that means. The AAUTZM podcast is now 2 years old. Woo! But yeah, this time, exactly 2 years ago, I was making my first podcast. I didn't think I'd be going for this long. I thought, I don't know, do a couple of shows and then run out of ideas. But, ta-da! Here I am, still here. I'd just like to thank everyone who's helped with my podcast show and everything else that I've done. I mean, so far, as of the 5th of January 2013, which is the uploading date of this recording, my podcast series has received a download count of 1,477. And that's not to mention the thousands upon thousands of views I've got on my YouTube channel for the YouTube uploads. But then again, they are in 4 parts, so there's going to be more. So, you know, I'm not exactly going to lie to you there.
Just for the usual announcements, for those of you listening to this on YouTube right now, my podcasts also exist on TalkShoe.com. In the video description, there's a direct link to the call series. So just for those of you who wanted to listen and download the full 60-minute podcast for free in MP3 format, you can do that there, because I know a lot of my fans like to listen to my podcast while doing their chores and driving. Just a cautionary note, guys, keep your eyes on the road if you listen to this while driving. I don't want to be responsible for any wrecks, thank you very much. But anyway, as for today's show, I'm happy to welcome back on Aaron Moritz. So if you'd like to say hello, Aaron.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be back on the show.
Mm-hmm. Last time we were speaking about the videos that you do and also the podcast that you're going to be doing soon. Obviously, by the time people listen to this, your podcast will already be out. So I was wondering what particular slant you would have on how you initially responded to the logic of the train of thought that is advocated by the Zeitgeist movement, as obviously denoted by the Zeitgeist films and the activist orientation video.
I think for the most part, I understood it right away, and I agreed with most of it right away, but I had a lot of the same objections that people have. Like, I think mostly the human nature objection. Like, this is a good idea, but I don't know if it's going to work. Like, people just won't actually do this. There's no way. They're too greedy. There's just too many problems that come up when you're dealing with people in the real world. You can't create something this good without somebody fucking it up, basically. Like, cause I remember in Addendum, the line that first, like, clicked it in for me that I was like, oh, like, this makes sense, was when, I think it's Roxanne says that they've never given scientists the job of how to design a society. We've always just sort of done it, like, let it fall as it may. You've never taken the time to beforehand say, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to get food to all of the people that are here? How are we going to create transportation systems that work and that aren't, harming the environment? Like, how do we design this? How do we do this with a plan rather than just on the whims of whoever happens to be in power at the time, when whatever priorities they happen to hold and however much money they happen to have, and whichever companies happen to propose an idea that sounds good, like, oh, let's build a road here, let's build a bridge here, let's make a power plant at this location, to design that all beforehand using the scientific method, using basically the process we have for figuring out whether something is going to work every time we do it. Repeatable results is the basic fundamental thing with science, is being able to repeat your results. So that notion of designing a society using science right away just made so much sense to me and seemed so logical and so obvious that that's what we should be doing, that I thought the only reason we can't be doing this must be because it's impossible. Like, people are too stupid and too emotional and too whatever. Just it's not gonna work. So I think that was my initial argument against it. And I think, kind of like I said last time, the thing that answered a lot of those questions for me was the orientation guide, because Peter goes into how if you design a society in such a way that people's needs are being met, then those sorts of behaviors will fall off drastically, if not disappear. I remember the line that really encapsulated that for me was when he says, who's going to steal a laptop when you can go and get one for free from the distribution center? And that just made so much sense. I was like, yeah, like who would? Or if they did steal it, who would even care? Just, okay, I guess I got to go get a new one. It's a minor inconvenience. I have to, go home and order a new one on my computer, or take a 10-minute trip down to the distribution center to get a new laptop. I guess that person who took it really needed it in that moment, so good for them,
Yeah. I mean, when I first watched the films, there was that sort of clash between the logic of the approach with the cognitive dissonance that is set in by, our cultural conditioning, where we think to ourselves, any betterment of our lives must be either communism or just complete utopian, impossible dreaming rhetoric,
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of that too comes from you hear a lot of rhetoric from politicians that sounds so good, and you're like, oh, things are going to get better when this person gets elected, or once this one's out of office, or it's always right around the corner. There's all these great things you hear about that are going to happen, and I mean, if you look at the Obama's campaign in the United States, that's probably the very best example of that. He campaigned on this huge platform of change and getting money out of politics and reversing the Patriot Act and all these things that sounded so good, and then almost none of them happened, and the ones that did happened half-assed. And like getting out of Iraq, 3 years later, they got most of the troops out of Iraq, but there's still a base there, and there's still a bunch of troops, and there's still ongoing operations, but major operations are over. You know what I mean? So it all just kind of never crystallizes. So when you see something that sounds so good, so like such a good idea, good future being presented, your immediate reaction is, oh yeah, but it's not actually going to happen. These things don't happen. Things don't get better. They just say they're going to, and then they fall apart.
Yeah, it's similar to, because I think there was one thing that Obama promised during his presidential campaign, that he was going to promise to get the troops out within 18 months of him being brought into office.
Right, yeah.
And I think something like 18 months later, he was discussing putting more troops back into combat. And that's obviously, one way that politicians like him would flip-flop on those kinds of things. And there was a thing I heard Romney saying that by 2013, he promises to get most of our troops out. And because of other things that have been happening geopolitically, I'm kind of like on the fence as to whether to believe him or not, because sometimes I think to myself, well, he may be saying that just like Obama said it, and then he's going to put more troops into combat, or he might be telling the truth because he's going to be taking troops out of combat, but into more positions where we're going to secure militarily any, security against civil uprisings.
Okay.
So it could be, that's the thing about, the things that they say. It could go either way,
And when people hear like, oh, I'm going to get the troops out of combat, they don't think, oh, well, out of combat and into security against uprising. They think, oh, that means they're going to be out of Iraq, and it's going to be, it's kind of like playing on words and playing with people's expectations in a way that someone who doesn't take the time to think it through like you just did is going to get a different impression of what he actually means by getting the troops out of combat.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, some of the things that do get set in, and even for people like ourselves who I'd say possibly 50-50 either free-thinking individuals to begin with, and then, like say for example with your conditioning that you got from punk music, you had that sort of fuck this shit sort of thing.
Yeah.
This isn't right. We want something better. And I was kind of of the same persuasion. It's just, we had that motivation. It's just, we weren't steered in any particular direction. Like, say, for example, I can't remember which particular ones, but like, say, for example, the things you see in a cartoon or a film where, someone is picked up and they're running in midair while being picked up, and then as soon as they're put down, they start running. That sort of thing. It's kind of like that. Before we actually encountered the train of thought of the Zeitgeist movement, we were just held in the air. We were running all the time. We wanted to run, but we weren't actually put on the ground to basically make any physical progress in any particular direction.
Yeah, it's a really good metaphor. I like that.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I don't think is actually appreciated by the majority of the populace who do interact with us when they call us they even turn the cognitive dissonance on us in a sense where they call us sheep to the Zeitgeist movement, that we're just idly following through any kind of utopian dream or anything like that, when they don't appreciate that we've actually gone through that process of cognitive dissonance already, and we've actually done a lot of thinking to combat our own cultural projections. And when I first came across the movement, I kept thinking to myself, but what if it's this? What if it's that? And I had to, it took me quite a long time to settle those sorts of things, because I was just mainly caught up in the anger of against the system. Oh no, there's all these problems, and because I was already a fan of the Loose Change film, so I already knew that I was already of the opinion that quote unquote 9/11 was an inside job. But even as my understandings have evolved, I've sort of gone more towards being on the fence sort of thing. So I'm kind of undecided about whether it was an inside job or not. So it's not just that being in line with the kind of train of thought that the Zeitgeist movement proposes as a whole. It's not just that it's affirmative for a particular social direction in terms of how we as a society want to move, but it's also affirmative for other different topics where we think to ourselves, you ask anyone on the street whether politicians are honest, and generally, 95% of the time, people will answer no.
Yeah.
So most people know that politicians are liars, but
they'll usually laugh at how absurd a suggestion it might be that politicians would tell the truth.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, because of this huge cultural Stockholm syndrome that we're experiencing as a collective society, they admit that politicians are liars and murderers even. But because of the cultural conditioning, they think, but politics is all we have. We've just got to get an ethical politician in power. So encountering this train of thought, it introduces us to the idea that, yes, politicians are liars, and that is exactly why we don't need them. It's not that we need to